Hey, what's up, guys? So, going to do a little bit of a deep dive on trigger control, and I apologize ahead of time for some of you guys. This is going to be kind of a longer, in the weeds discussion on some technique stuff. And I'm also not going to start like super basic. I'm going to assume folks that are interested in this have a decently high level of education on trigger pull and grip and that kind of thing. So if it goes over somebody's head, I apologize for that as well. But Paul Costa posted a video earlier with a lot of really great thoughts on grip and trigger control and things like that. A lot of really good stuff in there. But wanted to add a couple thoughts. There's things I've been chewing on for a while anyway. Because what it seems kind of right now is that it's almost like there are two competing camps in performance shooting. And it's like on one side are the folks that think that grip is really, really important, almost to the exclusion of all else. And then on the other side is the folks that think that trigger control is really important, again, almost to the exclusion of all else. And I would not consider myself to be in either one of those camps. I think that both are really important. I think that grip is probably the most important fundamental that there is. But it doesn't matter that, the way that you pull your trigger never matters. And I also think it's important to consider context, right? So as an example, Paul was shooting a 25-yard A zone in his video, which for a lot of folks seems like a super high, like elite accuracy standard. And then to other folks, it seems like it's incredibly easy, right? If you're not aware, like there's folks that are like shooting B8s at 50 yards and shooting like hundreds, right? So how are those guys pulling the trigger? There's a lot of different things, but same thing also, like we have to think about techniques that apply to like single hand shooting and other things other than just static single shot or even string type drill. So want to talk about a couple ideas that I have been working on and thinking through on grip and trigger press and things that work out to me. Important side note, I think, or disclaimer, is that different people do this differently. Part of that's due to the gear that you're shooting. Like when you're shooting an open gun, like your trigger press is a lot different than if you're shooting a stock Glock, obviously. But also I know like world champion guys that really like harp on trigger press in their classes. And I know that, there's world champion shooters that basically say you shouldn't ever prep your trigger at all and should just, always basically be smashing through it. So, but want to talk through a couple ideas that make sense to me. Hopefully it's helpful for you guys. So one of the problems with discussing trigger press is that it's difficult to understand a lot of times what people are talking about when we're talking about trigger press, because although you can see their finger moving, maybe if they're even bother to show it at an angle where you can in class or in a video, you can't feel what they're feeling, and you kind of have to take their word for it, like what they're saying. Sometimes you can't really tell. So hopefully this chart makes sense. We've got kind of travel across the bottom, or like how much the shoe is moving. And then we've got pressure, right? How much pressure are we stacking? A lot of people think about progressively pulling through the trigger like this green line, as if it's just kind of pulling straight through with no deviation. And in a sense, this is exactly what it looks like when we smash through the trigger up close, right? So in other words, if I, from the beginning of the trigger press, all the way out, instantly try to apply 8 pounds or whatever the pressure required is into my trigger, more than's required to break, then yes, I will smash all the way through. However, if I'm controlling that press at all, it's gonna look more like this blue line, right? It's impossible to progressively add pressure with varying levels of resistance and not have a variation in how fast my finger is going to move. I used to be a bow hunter a lot, and it's kind of the opposite of the wall in a trigger, in that it's significantly harder when you start pulling it, and then it gets significantly easier as you reach what's called the let off, right? And if you're like in front of a deer or up in a stand or whatever you're trying to draw, of course what you would want to do is like, very easily and in control, just kind of smoothly pull that thing back, right? And of course, it never looks that way. There's no way that you can modulate pressures perfectly enough to just smoothly pull it all the way through. What ends up happening is it's like really heavy when you start, and all of a sudden it kind of like as you get through that let off, right? And so what this kind of represents is that you kind of have this loose pre-travel until you get to the wall, and then with no movement in the shoe, you end up just stacking pressure until all of a sudden it breaks. Now, no trigger press would actually be this precise and smooth. Every trigger is a little bit different. You may have kind of multiple walls, so on and so forth, but this is what's supposed to happen, right? On a normal kind of, if you will, two-stage pistol trigger that has kind of a wall in it. This is what it's supposed to happen, okay? So let's define some things. So if I was gonna prep the trigger, to me what that means is I'm rushing to about that spot, right? Not just, a lot of people think of trigger prep as coming to here, just taking the slack out of the trigger. I wanna not only take the slack out of the trigger, but I wanna add, roughly 80% of the pressure required to break the shot, and hold there until my sights are typically on target, and then I will finish that press. We'll talk more about that in a second. However, I don't think anyone would debate, right? Is it easier to smash the trigger from here and get an accurate shot, or is it easier to smash the trigger from there and get an accurate shot? It's easier to do it from up here, right? Now, smashing from here, right? Similar to the drill that Paul was shooting, similar to Ben Steger's, trigger control at speed drill, similar to the way Rob Latham used to teach it. That kind of drill and that style of shooting is one of my favorite drills for grip diagnostics, right? Like Paul explained, right? If I can get the gun into a solid vise where it can't move, and then I smash the trigger, I'm still going to be putting bullets in the same hole because the gun couldn't move because it was in a vise. However, your hands are not a bench vise, and they're never going to one-for-one represent the lockdown and the stability that a bench vise offers, which is why, even if you're really good at that drill and you're starting from a perfect sight picture every single time, you have no vision issues, right? You're parking that dot right in the center of your A zone every single time, and then you're smashing the trigger. Even if you acceptably hold every single one of those shots inside your A zone, you're still not going to be shooting at the performance limit that your gun offers. In other words, if I put that gun in a ransom rest and that same thing, I might have, 1.5-inch, 2-inch group at 25 yards, something like that, depending on your pistol, whatever it is, right? You're not going to do that when you're shooting trigger control at speed. Why? Because you are moving the gun some when you press that trigger, right? And so at 25 yards, when your accuracy standard is just an A zone, and when you're starting with a perfect confirmation 3, still stopped round dot in the center of the A zone for every single shot, is it possible to smash the ever-loving heck out of your trigger and hold it to all A zones? Yes. But you are moving the gun some, and therefore it is easier to prep the trigger and smash from a prepped trigger than it is to smash from the trigger all the way out. Okay, so I think we can establish that, right? Now the argument would be, well, when I'm shooting at speed, I don't have time. And that's correct. It's 100% correct. So as an example, if I shoot a 7-yard A zone build drill, right? The splits I'm looking for are like those 10 to 14 type splits, right? I personally cannot, in a 1/10 of a second, come off the trigger, rush back to the wall, pause, and then press after seeing my sights. Like, I do not have enough time for all of that. It takes more time to come off on prep and then press than it does to simply bam, bam, off on, smash all the way through, right? It takes less control. I'm just kind of off on. There's no modulation happening there. I'm just coming off and then slapping back to that trigger. I can do that really quickly, whereas it takes more time to come off and then kind of on back carefully back to that wall and then smash or press or however you would do it from there. So I can't prep really at all when I'm going for like 10 splits, like predictive splits, right? So when can I becomes the question. When can I? To me, right, I can at least prep to here, right? I can come off on, feel where that wall is, and then confidently press from the beginning of the wall, around a 0.2 to a quarter second split, right? Around a 0.2 to a quarter second split, I can do that. Around a 0.3 to a 0.35 is where I can really, I think, reset to here, get a true prep, and then finish confidently that last 10 or 20%. Okay? So when I want to go fast, right? Why would I ever be shooting, a 0.3 or a 0.35 split? Because it's that hard to aim, right? It's that hard to aim. So, in other words, on a target where I am not just pulling the trigger every single time I see target through window, like a 7-yard A zone, at 25 yards, let's say I'm going to call that a confirmation 3 target. Let's say I want to see the dot come back and stop in the center of the A zone to guarantee an A zone hit every single time. If that's the requirement, for me, that's going to take me around 0.3 of a second to do. And therefore, if it's going to take me 0.3 of a second to aim, why would I not make it as easy on myself as I possibly can by removing all of the movement in the shoe, so that all I have to do once I get my sights on target is add that extra little 20%. Just my feeling, right? Some folks would say that, hey man, I actually find that, I start thinking about it too much, or I get the flinchies really bad or whatever if I prep the trigger. To me, that's simply a failure in training. No one has ever been able to logically explain at a theoretical level why there's a single limitation to trigger prep. You can say I don't like it, it doesn't work well for me, but that's not really an acceptable answer. I need to know why. I can tell you why trigger prep works, right? The reason why trigger prep works is because now to get the gun to fire, there's no movement required in the shoe. Zero movement. I simply have to add pressure, right? If I'm here, I no longer have to travel the trigger to break the shot. Practically speaking, all I have to do is stack this pressure until that shot breaks. And it's easier to stack half a pound of pressure with no movement without moving the gun than it is to move the trigger half an inch without moving the gun, right? That makes sense. I can understand that. So to me, trigger prep works, right? What I kind of do, right, when I am just isolating, doing trigger control at speed, will I do that slapping all the way through trigger out to 25 yards and even farther away or on even smaller targets? 100%. 100%. Because I want my grip to be so squared away that even if I make a mistake, my grip will kind of cover it up and help me keep the gun on target, right? But here's the thing to understand for me. Let's say that this is our target we're working on. And let's say I'm doing trigger control at speed at 25 yards. In other words, I'm bringing the gun up on target. Maybe I have my finger. There's different ways to do it. But let's say I'm just, just touching the trigger, right? I'm not actually starting from a prep. And on the timer or whatever it is, I'm smashing all the way through that thing, right? And let's say that I manage to, keep it all in the A zone, but my shot group looks kind of like that. I'm kind of filling up the A zone a little bit, right? I'm not stacking rounds in the same hole at 25 yards, doing trigger control at speed. I'm kind of filling up the A zone a little bit. Well, at speed, right? If I'm shooting a build drill, or if I'm drawing to that target, or if I'm transitioning onto that target, chances are really good that my dot every single time may not actually be 100% stopped exactly in the center of that A zone and just sitting there while I pull the trigger. There's probably gonna be some motion in there, right? Which means if this is gonna be my size group smashing that trigger, and my dot is actually like, here out towards the edge of that A zone, that could easily be a Charlie or a Delta, okay? So we have to understand that what we're able to do in, static, completely square to the target, completely not moving, and starting with all the time in the world to line up that perfect conformation 3 sight picture on that target is not 100% realistic to a course of fire or a stage or whatever we're shooting, right? At least that's kind of my take on it, okay? Here's where I think the biggest disparity in thought comes from on trigger prep. A lot of people think about trigger prep as if I'm seeing my sights on target here, right? I see my sights on target, and then instead of smashing the trigger, I prep and then pull the trigger, right? That's not how trigger prep works, okay? Again, say I'm at 25 yards on an A zone. As my gun is coming onto the target, either because of recoil recovery or a draw or a transition, as my gun is coming onto the target, I'm prepping the trigger so that my trigger is prepped and ready to go before I ever actually get an excitable sight picture. Okay? This is not going to be a perfect timeline, but just think about this with me. Okay? Let's imagine that I fire from the center of the A zone, first shot, right? Sights are lifting. Now, as my sights lift, let's imagine I'm coming from the break of the trigger back down here, okay? And by the time my sights lift, up in here somewhere on a 25-yard target, let's say I'm getting back to my point of reset, where the trigger is roughly all the way back out again, okay? And let's say, by the time it gets all the way up, however high you think your dot's gonna travel, and starts coming back down, as it starts coming back down, I'm starting to climb this mountain again, okay? And let's imagine that as my dot comes back down, roughly to the top of that head box, that I've gotten at least to the wall, okay? And let's now imagine that as the dot settles from the top of the head and starts coming down into the A zone, that I'm starting to stack that pressure a little bit, right? And let's just imagine that as that happens, the dot falls perfectly and I see it stop in the A zone. If that's the case, I'm not gonna stop stacking pressure, right? It's just gonna keep on going and it's gonna break, right? However, if, let's say the dot comes back down over here a little bit, it didn't land perfectly and I've gotta correct it, right? I will stop stacking pressure there until I see the dot come back into the A zone, and that's when I'm gonna add that extra little 10 or 20% of pressure on there and the shot breaks, right? So at no point on a target of this difficulty am I waiting on my trigger control to happen. That's not what it is for me. The way I think about it is simply, I am going to take advantage of any time that I have because of a draw or a transition or a recoil control recovery to get as much, to make it as easy on myself as I possibly can, right? To make it as easy on myself as I possibly can. There is no virtue in forcing yourself to doing things the hard way, okay? There's a lot of virtue in forcing yourself to do things the hard way in training, right? You should absolutely do things the hard way sometimes in training to see what happens and see if you can set up safeguards so that even if you screw things up or whatever, you still get a good result. But when it comes to like an actual scored drill or course of fire, I am cheating every way that I possibly can. I'm trying to make everything as easy on myself as I possibly can. And so for me, I find that pressing the trigger aggressively, again, this is kind of my wrap up, from here is way easier than pressing it from here. That's what I find. If I have a good grip, if my grip is perfect and my trigger press is squared away, the results on 2 perfectly executed trigger pulls might be exactly the same. 100% might be exactly the same. But doing it from here is easier. And therefore, if I have time, I'll make it easier for myself. Hopefully that makes sense, guys. Some of my thoughts. To be fair, like I said, I know very, very good shooters that don't do it this way, and probably disagree with my explanation of it. But that's kind of some of the understanding that I've come to through my own experimentation over the years, and hopefully maybe it'll make sense to you guys. If you got any questions, let me know.